Well, hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Vivian Garcia. I'm a marketing manager on the English team at Bedford St. Martin's, and we are so pleased to be able to sponsor this conference and to also share this workshop. And many thanks to Susan, who agreed to help with this workshop. So today's workshop is going to be how to teach WID in first year writing without being an expert in every discipline. So that's the catcher, right, as we like to say. Okay, if you could go to the next slide, Susan. Okay. So one of the things we like to say at Bedford is that we want to help you and your students achieve more. So what do we mean by that? Many of you have probably had firsthand experience with our various sales representatives, the specialists, the sales reps themselves, and even our in-house team. And we are incredibly committed to the discipline. Like I can even say from my experience, a lot of my colleagues have advanced degrees. They've taught English composition. Like we are really passionate about it. And the other cool thing about Bedford is that this is actually our 40th year, our 40th anniversary. So woohoo, yay for Bedford. In addition to that service and that commitment and everything that we put into our books, we also offer different resources. So you'll notice that second header that says community, and I'll be happy to share the link for that in the chat later. But the English community at Bedford, this is essentially a depot of all these wonderful resources. We have blog posts with teaching tips. We have professional resources as PDFs. We have a library of webinars on different topics. So, and we try to be very sensitive to trends and timeliness. So for example, when the pandemic hit, we had a series of webinars that covered topics like how to teach online effectively, or the advantages and disadvantages of teaching asynchronously versus synchronously. But just as a point of reference, these are the types of resources we put on the community site. And the best part of it is that it's absolutely free. All we ask is that you just register so that you have the opportunity to make comments or post materials or download other materials. And then finally, I mentioned our resources. So in addition to the English community, where we have those PDFs, in some instances, I know many of you may like to have an actual hard copy of a book. So we have a library of professional resources, and they range from teaching and developmental English, or teaching at the two-year college, using technology and literature. Like it really just does run the gamut of different areas. And I know we have, let's say, resources on portfolio teaching, or we have our bibliography, which also seems to be a very popular resource that we offer. So just in general, letting you know that in addition to the textbooks and the technology that we offer, we also have a lot of professional resources. So Susan, if you could go to the next slide. And then I just want to share how we're very passionately committed to English. I mentioned earlier how we've been in composition for 40 years. A lot of our staff teach or have taught and majored in English and composition. So just a great background there. And you could read for yourself, but we're just incredibly committed to the discipline. And Susan, if you could go to the next slide. And one of the ways we're committed is by our support of conferences and professional development. So on the left, we highlighted, like this conference, some of the different conferences throughout the English discipline that we've sponsored year in and year out. And then on the right-hand side, just as a point of reference, in addition to hosting or sponsoring national conferences, we also host some homegrown events of our own. So for instance, we have an HBCU conference, and we often team up with different colleges to run those. If I'm not mistaken, I'm trying to remember which school is our sponsor this year, and I'm forgetting, so forgive me for that. But that event's taking place in September, and I mentioned our community before. We post information about that event, about any forthcoming events we have on that site, and we welcome any number of registrants. So if you're interested, and then the WPA workshop, that's another event that we run. And you could see here the HBCU conference. The picture on the left is Andrea Lunsford, I think our first HBCU conference. And on the right-hand side is Anthony Ray Hinton, a trade speaker who actually at 4Cs, we often do a Bedford party and we have speakers at that event. So he was talking about his book, The Sun Does Shine, which, my goodness, if you just want a heartbreaking memoir, that is a beautiful work. So a little plug for Anthony Ray Hinton, just a great read. And if we could go to the next slide, Susan. And I think before I turn it over to you, let me take a moment to introduce Susan. I think many of you may already know her, but Susan Miller-Cochran is Executive Director of General Education at the University of Arizona, where she is also a professor of English. Her research focuses on higher ed administration and academic labor, especially in writing programs, instructional technology, curricular design, and multilingual writing. She formerly served as director of the writing program at UA. She was director of first-year writing at North Carolina State University and a faculty member in English ESL at Mesa Community College. She has also served as a past president of the Council of Writing Program Administrators, and she's a member of the executive committee on the Conference on College Composition and Communication. Her work has appeared in over 40 journal articles and book chapters, and she is the author of An Insider's Guide to Academic Writing, which is forthcoming in a new edition from Bedford this fall. And I promised Susan I'd mention this. Her family has a new addition, a beautiful, beautiful puppy named Pearl. And maybe Susan will deign to share a picture of Pearl later. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Susan.
Thank you, Vivian. Yeah, Pearl may decide to make herself known during the workshop without my solicitation too. So you never know. That's kind of how puppies are. But thank you so much for that gracious introduction. And I also wanted to say thank you to all of you for coming to the workshop today. I know it was a late addition to the schedule for the conference, but we were delighted to have the opportunity to talk about writing in the disciplines and first-year writing and some of the possibilities for that. And just given what everyone has been through in the last year and a half, I'm really grateful that you're taking the time to be here. I can only imagine that you have many other things you can spend your time doing. So we'll try to make this as useful, as practical in tangible ways as we possibly can. So I wanted to start first by asking you just to think about when the last time was that you had to write something in a genre with which you were not familiar, that you hadn't worked in before. And I'll ask this question a lot of times in writing across the curriculum workshops. And in those contexts, I have to define genre. Here I'm kind of speaking to my disciplinary buddies. So I'm assuming that you kind of know what I mean, but that you had to write in some kind of form or context in which you weren't familiar. One of the examples that I'll sometimes give to kind of get people thinking about it was the first time that I had to write a research paper when I started my master's in applied linguistics, and I had done my undergrad in English literature. And so I turned in this data-driven study for a sociolinguistics class, but I wrote it kind of like a thesis-driven essay that I would do in an English literature class. And my professor returned it to me and asked questions like, where is your review of literature? And where are your research questions? Where is your methods section? I was like, methods section? What does she mean? I had no idea what these different things meant because I hadn't really written that kind of a paper before. So when was the last time you had to write something in a genre with which you were not familiar? And then I want you to think about, what did you write? Like, how did you feel about writing that? And what strategies did you use to figure out what to do? So I'm going to give you a couple minutes and you could just jot down a couple of notes. You could put it in the chat if you'd like to share it with others. But just take a couple minutes to really think about how that felt and what strategies you used.
And something else I'd throw in is if you want to unmute and share it verbally, that you can also do that and just make a note that you'd like us to call on you.
And Vivian, you might be able to see people better than I can, and I can't see the chat right now. So
Yeah, I'll monitor the chat. So
awesome.
so far, so I'll start reading some of them while others may still be writing down their thoughts. So we have, let's see, let me start at the top. From Nelson Graff, he said, probably social science type essays in graduate school. I tried to model unpublished essays. And then from Marie Lourdes Silva, just recently I had to write a cover letter for a survey for IRB approval. Chris Taylor shares, I'm doing that right now, writing job descriptions. I ended up using Google to look at examples because I have no idea what I'm doing. Smiley face. Yeah, we've all been there, not knowing what we're doing and looking up a model. Christina M. Lavecchia said, humble genre. Learning how to write emails as a new hire and new WAC director felt nerve-wracking, which also made me self-conscious. Should I be overthinking an email this much? Strategy equals asked folks with more experience in admin and at my institution for advice. Bigger genre, learning how to write scientific papers with collaborators. So that was her second entry. Michael Todd said, most recently, a poetry workshop. Let's see.
Oh, yeah.
Carissa Brain shared, currently writing an online study skills resource for SAGE. I feel excited at the moment, but I'm only at the reading planning stage. The bit I like best, I highlighted all the guidance, much like I advise students to. So I like that, right? Following the advice.
Yeah. And then I can see the chat now. It looks like Christina was sharing one of the strategies.
Oh,
she
cool.
used leaning on collaborators for what she had mentioned earlier. These are fantastic examples. And the more examples you're sharing, the more I'm thinking of examples for myself too, like, oh yeah, like just things that recently, the job description one, that's such a great one. I learned recently that I'm not always that great at writing job descriptions because I had to start a new office for general education, created all of these different jobs, and we're still kind of figuring out like who's doing what and how do we clarify these. Some of these genres are hard to write.
Yeah, I'm seeing a few more like helping students write a resume for an English speaking country, memorandum between two programs, op-ed for local alternative newspaper, grant proposals, stock power and transfer form. I do not envy the person that can do that one with legal financial action systems.
The disclosure for selling a house.
Right.
That's always a tough one. So I'm wondering if anyone does feel, as Vivian had suggested, is anyone willing to share a little bit verbally about how you felt when you first started trying to write in this different genre? Would anybody be willing to share that?
Hi, this is Christina Lavecchia. I'm willing to talk some more.
Thanks, Christina.
Sure. Yeah, so I shared my humble genre example of, again, learning how to write emails, especially when communicating with adjuncts that I was in charge of staffing sections with, or then when learning how to communicate with kind of some tricky, prickly administration. So that was definitely something that took a lot more time and energy than I thought it would, even though I know that admin folks who have shared experiences in the past that have mentored me always talk about, oh yeah, tracking your time. Emails always take up so much time. I just thought of it as volume, not as, oh, writing one specific email might actually take more time than you think. And then with my other example of writing in scientific papers, definitely some imposter syndrome, because sometimes I would say things confidently about the way I thought writing worked, and then found out that it doesn't work that way in this other context.
Yeah.
And so learning just how to, you mentioned humility, just learning how to be humble, and looking at just leaning on examples over and over again, and leaning on collaborators and taking feedback.
Oh, I love that example. Both of those examples are so good. I was thinking too about that first example with writing emails, that in the new context that you're in too, like you're navigating who your audience is now, what their expectations are, trying to figure out how you're projecting who you are, what your persona is. in that context. All of these things are really challenging. Thank you for sharing that, Christina. Did anyone else want to share a little bit about their example or an example they thought of?
I'm willing to share.
Okay.
Mary Lourdes, and so just yesterday, actually, I was working on the cover page for this survey that I need IRB approval on. And so in starting it, I just thought, okay, where do I get these invitations for surveys on the WPA listserv? So I went there and tried to find something that looks similar to my study. And then I found one. I'm like, all right. So then I used that as a model. And then I was thinking of my audience being the IRB committee, and also thinking the people that will be taking the survey. And so then I workshopped it with 2 colleagues of mine yesterday, and she's like, this is your cover page, right? And then I was like, what do you mean by cover page? So knowing that the term that I thought of a cover page was in a different context, in the context of submitting a resume for like a job or something. And now it has like, there's a cover page for the survey that you put on Qualtrics. And so I was like, oh, okay. And that was because I was using Google Forms, and Google Forms doesn't have a cover page. So there's like some technical aspects to it. And because in Qualtrics, I guess there's probably an option that says add cover page or something. I don't know. I haven't used Qualtrics yet. So it's just interesting trying to imagine different audiences, but also different digital platforms, and also just, you know, not as familiar with the genre itself. And so anyway, so it's so I'm still working on it, but she gave me a model. She was like, here, I'm doing a survey, use my template. And so I'm like, okay. So but now I have a better idea where it will go, and a better idea of like who will be for. So I needed that person to say, you did it wrong, here's the way you're supposed to do it. So trying to figure out on my own got me somewhere, but I definitely came to a dead end, I guess, trying to do it on my own.
Wow, thank you for sharing that example. These are such rich examples of, I would say, empathizing with what our students are often feeling too. And I think you all probably figured out where I was going with that. It's not too secretive or hidden, but this is exactly how our students often feel. Sometimes when they enter our first year writing classes, but certainly when they start going into the classes in other disciplines where they're asked to write things that they might not have had to write before, that they're not familiar with, and they're not sure what strategies to draw on. And so I tend to think of first year writing as a space where we can prepare students for those kinds of experiences. It's not that I can teach them about every single genre that they're going to encounter. There's no way. And if there's one thing I've learned in my 25 years in writing programs that makes me feel a little bit old, but it's that I absolutely can't predict what kinds of writing assignments my colleagues in other disciplines are going to give. And sometimes they're, you know, really interesting, inventive assignments, but because these aren't fields with which I'm not familiar, then I can't always anticipate what they'll be. But I can give my students strategies for how to approach those assignments. And so that's what my goal is. I want to try doing, and I'm not sure if the best way to do this would be, it's just a yes, no question, to maybe have you indicate you could either raise your hand or use the yes, no, if we can do that. I was trying to see if we have access to that in the reactions, but you could just raise your hand too. I won't call on you right now, but how many of you have tried using some kind of disciplinary approach in a first year writing class, either just for an assignment, like an individual assignment, or for the class as a whole? How many of you have tried doing that before? Okay. So I see a few hands. Awesome. So as we go through some of this today, I was going to say this morning, but for some of you, it may not be morning. Then you may have some examples that you can share with us too.
And Susan, from the chat, there was a quick question about, it would depend on what you mean by disciplinary approach.
Fair enough. And I think by the end of this workshop, then what I mean by that will probably be pretty clear. But right now, I just mean however you would define that coming into this workshop. All right. So let's start to kind of get into the meat of what I wanted us to talk about this morning. So when I use the acronym WID, I mean writing in the disciplines, just to make sure that I'm really clear about that. And I would argue that one of the biggest challenges that we face, especially in first-year writing classes, but really in any writing classes we teach, is transfer of knowledge. And so helping students transfer, or I really like the language that Liz Wardle uses of repurposing knowledge that they've used in one context and using it in another, but helping students transfer what they've learned in a writing class and repurpose that into other classes that they take in college, and hopefully into their careers and lives beyond college. We want to help them figure out how to use what they learn in our classes to approach new writing situations that they encounter. And ultimately, I want the classes that I teach for students to be really useful, and so that they can use those skills in other contexts. For decades, as I'm guessing most of the people here know, because in some ways I'm sort of preaching to the choir on this one, but for decades, writing classes have been taught using writing genres that are intuitive to the writing teachers themselves. So think, literary analyses or thesis-driven essays, things that we might be familiar with in English classes, expecting students to figure out the connections between writing in our English classes and then all of their other classes in college. What we know, though, from the research of a lot of our colleagues in writing studies is that students don't always transfer that knowledge on their own, and they don't always use it in useful ways. When they try to, for example, and I'm oversimplifying a bit here, but if they try to write a 5-paragraph thesis-driven essay for a biology lab assignment, or they don't understand that they can't just always use MLA for citations in every class, then sometimes they're lost if that's the foundation that we've given them. They don't have a set of tools to rely on in that new writing context. So for 9 years, I directed, as Vivian had mentioned, the writing program at North Carolina State University. And in that program, we specifically focused on teaching students about writing in academic disciplines to help build scaffolding for that transfer. And now in the general education program that I direct at the University of Arizona, we're launching a writing across the curriculum program. We haven't had a big effort in writing across the curriculum at the university in a long time. But one of our areas of emphasis is trying to help students repurpose what they learn in first-year courses, writing being one of those, but we're also trying to think about it in math and in languages and in other areas. So repurpose what they learn in those courses for other courses and contexts. So the book that Vivian mentioned that I co-authored with Macmillan showcases some of the things that I and my co-authors, Roy Stamper and Stacy Cochran, have found most useful and effective when teaching for transfer with a focus on the academic disciplines that students encounter at the university. We wanted to have a text that would help students build bridges from their writing classes to their other classes and careers. And we knew that if students learned how to recognize, analyze, and understand the kinds of academic writing that they would encounter throughout college in that first-year writing class, then they would be better able to transfer that knowledge into a new context. One of the things that we also found, and the three of us taught together at NC State, but we also found that this approach was appealing to students. And what I found over the 10 years that I was at NC State was that students not only transferred that knowledge, but they recognized the usefulness of learning it from day one. And as a writing program administrator, I am very used to having students come to my office at the beginning of the semester and tell me that they don't need to take first-year writing. They took AP English in high school. They've already done this. Is there some way that they could get out of taking this class? And in the interests of honesty and self-disclosure, I actually was one of those freshmen as an undergraduate. So I spent pretty much my entire freshman year working on figuring out how to get out of taking first-year writing. And my advisor from my undergrad never fails to remind me how amusing she finds it, that this is what I've spent my entire career doing now. But I was used to having students come to my office saying this, and what I noticed immediately with a writing in the disciplines approach was that students didn't come to my office nearly as often. In fact, they almost never did, trying to get out of first year writing, because when they saw the curriculum, they understood the value of it, and they saw that it was different from what they had done before in high school English. As a side bonus, faculty and other disciplines and the administrators across campus really understood, and I would argue perhaps for the first time, what we were doing in first year writing, and they valued it. They understood what it was about. Writing in the disciplines courses and initiatives often are focused on students at the upper division level as they work through classes in their majors, as they're becoming acclimated to the kinds of writing that they'll do in those majors. But what I found is that using a WID approach that is specifically designed as an introductory approach in first year writing can have a really powerful place in a foundational writing course, because it builds a bridge to those upper division classes. So I've especially found it to be powerful for students when they're analyzing, understanding, and writing about writing in the disciplines in foundational writing courses. But considering teaching or leading a program in this direction in a writing in the disciplines approach can be really challenging. And I want to address a couple of those challenges head on, because it's important to acknowledge that they're out there. One of the biggest challenges that I found is faculty comfort level. Most of the teachers that I've worked with, in fact, I think all of the teachers in the 2 major writing programs that I've directed have backgrounds in English, maybe in applied linguistics, but for the most part, it's the various disciplines in English. And for a teacher with a background in English, talking about writing in other disciplinary areas can feel really uncomfortable and unfamiliar, not that differently from how we all felt approaching those genres that we talked about in the chat at the beginning and that we shared about. I felt uncomfortable at first with the idea of talking about writing in the sciences, for example, even though, I mean, I started out as a pre-med major in college, but that was, we'll just say many years ago. And maybe, yeah, I don't need to give the exact number, but it was a really long time ago, and writing in the sciences has changed much in that time. And I imagined that other faculty and graduate students teaching in the program that I was directing would be really uncomfortable with that too. The difference was that once I realized I could draw on my own disciplinary knowledge, my rhetorical knowledge, and my expertise in that area as the framework for talking about writing in other disciplinary areas and how to understand writing and analyze writing in other disciplinary areas. And I'll talk about that a little bit more with some examples of how to do this. But another challenge is figuring out how to facilitate that transfer of knowledge effectively. And I was really concerned at first that I was going to be teaching inaccurate information about disciplinary genres, and that students might transfer that knowledge in ways that were disruptive to their success. And this is something that Liz Wardle has talked about in her research too, especially in her 2009 article in 3Cs, where she talks about MUT genres, and that we need to be cautious about that. So that was one of the other challenges that I faced. And then finally, as an administrator, I always have this concern in the back of my mind about how first year writing is perceived as a service course and not as part of a discipline that has a range of knowledge and its own ways of knowing. And so I had concern that this approach might emphasize that even more. And I wanted to make sure that the knowledge in our field about writing, genres, conventions, processes, that all of that was not lost in an effort to prioritize what other disciplines might think we should be teaching about writing. Because as we all know, many of our colleagues have very strong opinions about what we should be teaching in first year writing. So I wanted to make sure that I was not creating more of a problem in that area too. But what I started to realize was that the most effective ways of teaching or writing in the disciplines approach in first year writing don't solely emphasize mastery of various disciplinary genres. And instead, they draw on, as I mentioned before, the disciplinary expertise of the writing faculty teaching the courses. So focusing on rhetorical principles, close observation and analyses of texts, understanding the context for writing. So the rhetorical context in a WID-focused course just happens to be writing in different academic disciplines. So I'm just giving my students a specific rhetorical context in which we're going to be analyzing writing. And students engaged in close rhetorical reading of writing, students then are engaged in close rhetorical reading of writing in different disciplinary areas. So when I used that approach, I realized that students would leave my first year writing class better prepared to write in contexts outside of my class because they would know what to pay attention to, even though they were going to be encountering contexts that we never actually discussed in my class. But if they left my class knowing what questions do I ask, what do I need to pay attention to, then all of those things that I saw as challenges, I could turn into and see as advantages. So when I started to take what I knew about writing in rhetorical context and apply it to that WID context and help other teachers in the program to do the same, all those reasons that I had listed as challenges for teaching that approach were countered by arguments for why there were advantages to it as well. Faculty would be able to teach students rhetorical principles in a really rich, meaningful context. So I had always been asking faculty to teach rhetorical context, but now the context that they were focusing on was one that was really rich and meaningful to the students themselves. And then both the students and I could see the potential for transfer with the approach, and we would talk about it in class when I was teaching a great deal. So what are the ways that you might use this knowledge in other contexts? And I could help guide that and shape it. And then finally, yes, there is that potential for the stigma of a service course, but students really understood the exigency of the course content because they understood the potential for transfer. And as long as I was focusing on that rhetorical knowledge, I still could emphasize the important disciplinary contributions that this kind of an approach was based on, disciplinary contributions and knowledge and writing studies. And they were really motivated. So I wanted to hear from you too. Are there other challenges and advantages that you can imagine to using some kind of a writing in the disciplines approach in first year writing that I haven't listed? And you could just list any of those that you can think of in the chat. Either challenges or advantages.
And while we're waiting for those responses, I just thought I'd share, some people have been commiserating with you in the chat, like saying, I too was that first year student that didn't want to take first year writing, or I also struggled because I was a science major being asked to write in the humanities. So
Yeah.
a lot of similar experiences.
Yeah. Lots of empathy. I think anytime that I can put myself into a situation where I remember what it feels like to be a student who's encountering these kind of uncomfortable situations of writing, the more often I can do that, the better. And as a few people are writing some good advantages and disadvantages or challenges in the chat, I'll just share. I started during the pandemic, as we were all figuring out, well, what skill am I going to work on over the pandemic? We were all supposed to become fluent in new languages, right? Or something like that. But I decided to start taking classes in the culinary arts program in our local community college, which has been really, really fun. But it has been so good to be back in the position of being a student in a discipline with which I am totally unfamiliar. I mean, I love baking, but I am not an expert in that area, especially in some of the genres, like when we're asked to do writing assignments. Yeah, that's been a good news situation for me too. So there's a couple of interesting advantages and challenges in here. So I see a couple of advantages: reinforcing the importance of writing, regardless of the career students are pursuing. It can also help students feel like academic insiders, absolutely. Ruben points out one challenge is engaging students whose majors do not require much writing, and that's absolutely true. I think that really highlights the importance of having good communication with the faculty in those other disciplines to learn what kinds of writing are they assigning in those disciplines. And I'll give a nod to Dan Meltzer's book in here too, and Dan is in the session, but his book on academic or on writing assignments across the curriculum is a really helpful resource too, in thinking about what kinds of assignments you might encounter, or just seeing a nice example of a study that could help you think about how you might collect some of that information on your campus. That's something we've been working on at U of A, trying to understand. Christina mentioned another disadvantage is finding space in the curriculum to treat different disciplinary areas equally. Absolutely. And yes, I totally understand, Lindsay. Faculty in my program, she says, are worried about having an overly prescriptive curriculum. I'm starting slow by continuing to let them take the approach that makes the most sense to them. Yeah. And I agree, Kimberly, it can be great for students to learn the importance of audience and the need to have a logical flow in making outlines for assignments. I think one thing I had always really struggled with was, I know how important it is to teach students about audience, but sometimes I would struggle with thinking of a really authentic audience that was important to them. And once I could anchor this to their future career goals, their desire to do well in their other classes, then that gave us some context, some shared common ground to talk about audiences that would be important to them. Carissa says, in the UK context, she teaches first-year mixed discipline modules in academic writing. These are optional modules, so are often chosen by students who really struggle with writing. This can mean that they can struggle with analyzing text. That makes a lot of sense, Carissa. So having a really good framework to help them with that analysis, it sounds like, would be really helpful. All right, these are great examples. Well, what I wanted to talk through for the majority of our time today were a couple of different examples or approaches to how you could teach writing in the disciplines. And depending on your institutional context, the kinds of majors that tend to be most popular at your institution, what students you're working with, different approaches might have more success. And so I'm going to walk through 3 possible approaches and then give some examples of the kinds of assignments that you might use in that kind of an approach. And I want to underscore that sometimes these kinds of assignments can be really useful in isolation, just in the middle of a curriculum that is maybe emphasizing rhetorical context in other ways too. But it might just be one assignment that you're putting in there to teach them about the context of academic writing. And it can also work really well, of course, as a full course. But I've worked with teachers in programs who have used all 3 of these different approaches. And as I talk through them, I also want to emphasize that they aren't, they're not discrete approaches. In other words, you don't have to pick just one or the other, but several of these approaches can work really well together, even in the same course. In the program at North Carolina State, we would have a lot of teachers who would they'd kind of go back and forth between different assignments that emphasize different approaches to writing in the disciplines. And different kinds of assignments would sometimes reach different students in different ways too. So that can also be really helpful. I also wanted to emphasize, in response to the comment that Ruben had made in the chat earlier, I think every school I've worked at so far has had an emphasis on engineering. And for whatever reason, that seems to be one of the disciplines where I'll often have students who say, yeah, I'm really not going to need to write much in my discipline. And one of the approaches that I have found most useful is for me to not necessarily make the argument to them that writing is going to be important. It might be important in different ways, but they hear that much better when it comes from faculty or students or professionals in the field that they want to go into. And so I could talk through a couple of examples of assignments that I sometimes have students do where they learn a little bit about that as well. So I do think, though, that it's important that we talk about what a writing in the disciplines approach looks like in a first year writing or foundational writing course. I use those terms interchangeably. We call it foundations writing at U of A because not everybody takes it in their first year. Sometimes they'll wait to take it in their second year. So I'm going to talk about 3 different approaches, and they'll be outlined a little bit more on the next slide here. But so let me talk through what these look like a little bit. And I'm sure there are many other approaches, and some of you might want to share this when we get into Q&A as well. But these 3 approaches that I'm going to talk about today are topical, rhetorical, and genre-based. So in a topical approach, you might be looking at a specific issue or topic, but looking at how different disciplines might approach it. This is an approach that I've often used when I'm teaching classes that focus on argumentative writing or issue-based writing or research-based writing. So I might have students choose an issue, but then ask them to find sources that approach that issue from different disciplinary perspectives. And then I'll ask them to pay attention to things like, what kinds of questions are they asking? What kinds of data are they reporting? What citation styles are they using? All different kinds of things that we'll look at. So a topical approach, though, is organized according to an issue, a topic, a theme. A rhetorical approach is focused on understanding and analyzing the rhetorical context of the writing that you're looking at. And so I'll give some examples of assignments in this as well. But it's focusing on a lot of those principles and foundations that many of us, I think, have learned to emphasize when we're teaching first year writing. And it was definitely the approach that I was taught when I took TA training long ago, that students need to understand audience and context and purpose. So we just look at that in an academic, in a disciplinary context. And then finally, a genre-based approach focuses on understanding specific genres that tend to be common in different disciplines, and maybe focusing on some of the genres that tend to cross different disciplinary boundaries too. And so I'll talk about that a little bit more. I'm actually gonna discuss that first. So I'm drawing some on the work of Mike Carter, who wrote a really foundational piece in 2007 that was published in SEAS, where he talked about a concept that he identified as meta-genres. And he identified 4 meta-genres that I have in this image on the slide that cross different disciplinary boundaries. So we see problem-solving genres in many different disciplines, or empirical inquiry genres in different disciplines, research from sources, and performance. But of course, the way that those manifest in specific disciplines, the conventions of those might differ from one discipline to the other. So the guiding question for me, if I'm designing a first year course that's focused on this genre-based approach, is what are the common genres in a particular discipline and what conventions do they share? And I might tweak that a little bit to say, what genres are shared in common across different disciplines? And then what conventions do they share? And maybe what conventions are different? What can we understand about what is similar and different in those conventions across the disciplines? And when I talk about conventions, in the textbook that we wrote for Macmillan, in an insider's guide, we use a particular framework for helping students understand and analyze those conventions. There are other frameworks that could work really well too. The framework that we use is focused on understanding structure, language, and reference. And I'll get to a slide when we talk about one of the other approaches that outlines that a little bit more. But we have them look at the structure of the piece of writing, and then we have them look at the use of language in it. And there are a lot of different questions related to the use of language that we have them consider. And then we have them look at referencing conventions. And that doesn't just mean the citation style that's used, but also how often are the authors referring to the work of other scholars? How much are they basing their argument on that foundation? What space or what emphasis does referencing other people's work have in this? And it's really interesting, even within the same discipline, sometimes to look at that across genres. And that might be something in a more advanced class, but those referencing conventions can, of course, shift depending on the specific genre someone in a discipline is writing, or they're publishing it, all kinds of things. But we have them look at structure, language, and reference as kind of a guiding framework for understanding those different genres that they're looking at. So an example of an assignment that I sometimes use when I'm using this approach, and this might be an entry-level assignment that I would use in a course, is having them do an annotated bibliography. And annotated bibliographies are common in different disciplines. Sometimes what we'll do is we'll do an annotated bibliography and then turn that into a review of literature. And we'll talk about doing research from sources and referencing other people's work and how those different genres work in different ways. But annotated bibliographies and, of course, literature reviews can look very different in different disciplinary contexts. And so this is just one example of how I approach this sometimes in a class that's more of an issue-based or argument-based class, but I want to emphasize this particular genre. So I'll have them develop a bibliography of annotated sources from across different disciplines on the issue of their choice. But I'll ask them specifically to look at some of the kinds of conventions in the different sources that they're analyzing, and I'll have them make that part of the annotation that they're writing too, so that they're understanding what they're looking at and how these different genres might vary from one discipline to the other. There are a couple of other examples of assignments that I might use in a genre-based approach. And let me see if I can, I'm never good at going backwards in slides. So I'm gonna stop sharing for a second and go back if I can. Whenever I want to go backwards, I always end up just continuing. Oops, that's not what I want. Do that. Continuing to go forward in my slides. So there are a couple of other kinds of assignments that I might use in that more genre-based approach. So an annotated bibliography would work. But if you think about those different meta-genres that Mike identified, empirical inquiry might be a really interesting one, especially if you work with a lot of students in the sciences and in the social sciences. Then you might have them look at the reporting of data across different disciplines. And what does that look like? And what are some of the things that are similar and different? So it's analyzing some of that, but then understanding what kinds of questions might they ask about what's expected of them as they're entering different contexts and asked to engage in empirical inquiry or to report on data. So that's kind of what a genre-based approach might look like, focusing on those common genres and then understanding what conventions they share. A second approach, as I mentioned before, would be a topical approach to WID, and I put this map up again of different disciplines across the curriculum. And so a guiding question for a topical approach might be, how do different disciplines approach the same subject? Now, that annotated bibliography assignment that I shared might be one thing that I also would use in this kind of an approach too. But in those annotations, I might have them focus on questions like what kinds of research questions are they asking? What kinds of data are they focusing on, if any? How are they building their argument? From this disciplinary perspective, what part of the issue are they focusing on or emphasizing the most from this disciplinary perspective? And one of the things I always add, if I have students do an annotated bibliography when I'm using a more topical approach, is I'll have them write a conclusion about what they learned from looking at that issue or topic from multiple disciplinary perspectives. And I ask them to imagine, you know, like if you were, let's say that I have a student who's writing about something related to climate change. So I want you to imagine that you have all of these scholars who wrote these articles together in a room, and you can have them have a conversation about how to resolve some of the issues that you've identified from climate change. How would that conversation go? And what advantage might you have when you have those different disciplines in conversation with each other as you're trying to come up with solutions? And then also, what might be really challenging about that? If they're all looking at different kinds of data, are they maybe talking past each other? What kinds of things do you identify there? So I ask them to think about how different disciplines approach the same subject. Another assignment that I often use in a topical approach is an issue analysis. And this might be something that I have them do after they've done an annotated bibliography. And you'll notice in the description for the assignment there that under sources, it says to use the 6 to 8 sources from your annotated bibliography. So when I used this assignment in this particular context, the annotated bibliography preceded it. But what I have them do here is to really take all of those different sources from the annotated bibliography and analyze the issue. What's making this issue complex? What makes it difficult to resolve? And then specifically, how are the perspectives of different disciplines important in helping to understand what's complex about it? And then finally, the third approach I wanted to talk about is a rhetorical approach to writing in the disciplines. And this is probably what I've seen used most commonly as sort of a guiding approach, since this often aligns with a lot of the rhetorical training that our faculty and graduate students have most recently. But the guiding question is, what can we learn rhetorically by examining the writing in a particular discipline? And again, I've put that framework that we tend to use when we talk about, when we're rhetorically examining disciplinary writing. So I ask students to think about structure, language, and reference. And again, with structure, we're looking at issues, not just of formatting, although that can be part of it, but looking at how arguments are structured, or if it's something like an empirical study, how the delivery of data is structured, what are the conventions that people tend to follow in this particular framework. And then with language, we might look at some of the more superficial things might be specific uses of jargon in a particular discipline, but it may also be questions about things like the use of passive voice or the use of first person and third person. And when do you see people in different disciplines approaching language in different ways? And many of my students have had English teachers over the years tell them things like, well, never use I in an academic paper, or always use the active voice, don't use the passive voice. And then they'll get into, for example, a science class where they're reporting empirical research, and maybe the don't use I rule still applies, but the never use the passive voice rule all of a sudden is out the window because it seems like that's exactly what they're expected to do. Or they might be in my class, and this has happened many times because I like to emphasize reflective writing a lot in my first year writing classes too. And I'll have them write more formal pieces that are reflective. And at least at the beginning of the semester, they might struggle with that rule of not using I. How do I reflect on my own work if I can't use I? And then I say, well, you can't. I actually want you to use I. That's okay. And then we just talk about context, like when is it appropriate? When is it not appropriate? And how do you figure that out? So questions about language can be really interesting and can sometimes be good myth busters for students too. They've learned sometimes internalized hard and fast rules without really understanding that those rules are contextual. And it's important to understand the context about them. And then finally, I mentioned referencing in a little bit more detail. One of the examples that we give in an insider's guide is from a faculty member at the University of Wyoming. He's an astrophysicist, and he talks earlier in the book about taking the same research and interpreting it or writing it in different forms and different genres. So he talks about writing a press release, which is a really interesting one to me because he reveals he had never written a press release before and he felt really uncomfortable with it. And the press release he wrote didn't work very well because he didn't really understand the genre well, and it was difficult for him to take his scientific work and translate that in a way that would make sense, like to journalists that might pick up the story. He also talks a little bit about how, depending on which journal he's sending a publication to, the referencing expectations might be different. So in one journal, they might expect you to cite every single study that's been published on a particular issue. In another journal, they might expect you to cite only the most recent study because that references everything else. Or they might, and it's on and on and on. And we also know, those of us who have published things academically, that sometimes it depends on who your reviewer is, and they may just want you to cite something that they wrote too, but that's a little bit more difficult to explain to students. But those referencing conventions can be
Susan, there was a
really
question in the
difficult for
chat,
them.
if I may.
Yeah, go ahead.
So Carissa Brain asked, do you generally analyze published professional disciplinary texts, or do you also analyze highly graded student assignments from different disciplines?
That's a great question. So I have done both, but it may depend in your context on what you have access to. So if you have good partnerships with faculty and other disciplines, it's really wonderful if you can get examples of student writing from them. There are two things that I've done though to kind of work with not having good examples of student writing in other disciplines. So one is that, and this is an assignment that one of my students came up with that I think she was kind of riffing off of Dan's book that I mentioned earlier, but she would have her students all bring a writing assignment that they had gotten in one of their other classes to class. And what they would do is they would analyze the assignments that they were given in their other classes and try to understand what are the expectations that are being either explicitly described or implied in the assignment. She did a really nice, and that could be either a lower stakes assignment that you just do in class one day, or it could be a higher stakes paper that students do. But the other thing that I have them do that gets a little bit more directly, Carissa, I think at what you're asking, is that one of the very first assignments I give my students in my class, and sometimes I'll just have them post this in a discussion forum informally instead of doing it as a formal assignment, but I'll have them do an interview with someone in the major that they're interested in. A lot of our incoming majors at U of A are undeclared, or incoming students are undeclared majors. So they might have a lot of different interests, but they don't know exactly what they want to do. So what I'll ask them to do is to find either a upper division student or a professional in the field that they think they're interested in. And most students can come up with one of those. If they can't, then I'll help them out a little bit, or we might find a faculty member, but they do an interview with them. Sometimes I'll ask them to, especially if it's an upper division student, to ask the student if they could see an example of something that they've written in that major, and then I'll just ask them not to share the piece of writing with the class, but to tell the student or to tell the other students in our class what they noticed, what they learned about looking at it. Was there anything that surprised them? Anything unique? Another thing that I'll do if I want to have them look at published professional examples, and this is another one of my favorite assignments, is I'll have them find a publication from a professor that they're taking a class with that semester. And because I kind of want them to understand these are real people who write these pieces. Like that's not, and sometimes it's hard to really internalize that, but these are people that you're actually taking classes with. So I'll have them look for a piece of published writing, but I don't tell them that it has to be a scholarly journal article. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that some disciplines, that's not necessarily what they publish most often. But another is that I want them to have an understanding of the kind of the richness of the different kinds of genres that people write in different professions. So I'll just ask them to look for a published piece of writing from a professor that they're taking a class with. It's a good way to teach them the super basic skills of searching databases. So I'll show them how to do that. And if we're in class, we'll do it. We'll start working on it in class so I can help them troubleshoot. I have had a few students in the past who have said that they can't find an example. Like, I don't think that my professor really has published anything. And that may be the truth, that may be true, depending on the institutional context and how much that is emphasized. But I can think of one example that I had with a student who was in dance at the University of Arizona. And he said that he couldn't find anything in the database, and he was primarily looking for scholarly articles. And so we expanded his search, and what he found that a couple of his professors had written were reviews of performances, but they were in popular publications. I said, okay, so let's work with this. Let's take a look at this as a genre that is more common in your discipline. And what I love about this approach is it allows me, and this is getting at the title of the session, it allows me to not be the expert. And one of my co-authors, Stacy, wrote a blog post in the Bedford Bits in their community resources area where he talks about a specific example of a student that he was working with who couldn't figure out what he wanted to write about in the class, and shared with Stacy that one of the things he was most interested in, I think he was majoring in materials engineering, maybe, which I also am married to Stacy, so I know that he's not an expert in materials engineering. He's a really great fiction writer, but he doesn't do materials engineering. That's what the student was majoring in, but he was kind of majoring in it because I think that was the direction his parents had sort of directed him. He didn't really know what his interests were in that area. And so in a one-on-one conference with him, Stacy just engaged him in conversation about, well, what are you interested in? Like, what do you like to do in your spare time? And the student shared with him that he was a luthier. And do any of you know what a luthier is? I was not familiar with this term. Yes, okay, Lindsay knows. So someone who makes violins or guitars, stringed instruments. Yeah, so this was not something with which I was familiar. And Stacy didn't know the term. So he asked the student, okay, I don't know a whole lot about luthiers, tell me what you do. And so the student he was interested in making guitars, and he kind of informally worked, I think, with a guitar shop in Raleigh, and just liked hanging out there and learning about making guitars. And this is what he was interested in. And so Stacy said, okay, so what if that was what you studied? They had to pick a project that they were going to do some data collection on. He said, well, what if you looked at, if you want to take materials engineering and kind of combine that with being a luthier, what about looking at different materials that are used for making guitars? And this, as Stacy described it, like the student's face just lit up. He's like, so like I could look at different types of wood and how that changes how the sound resonates from the body of the instrument. And Stacy's like, yes, exactly. Like, this is not necessarily what Stacy was an expert in, but it's just asking questions and getting the students to really think about, well, what are you interested in? What might you want to learn about? And I think most importantly, with the student I gave the example with in dance, I just asked him, teach me about this. What can you teach me about how you see your professors writing reviews of performances? What does that look like? What do you think the expectations are? And we generated questions around structure, language, and reference. But then he got to be the expert and teach the rest of us about that. So here, let me go. I just wanted to give you 2 examples, and this is, again, using more of a rhetorically based approach. And so one of the most common assignments that I see teachers use in first-year writing when they're using a rhetorical approach is they have students do rhetorical analyses. And we can have students do rhetorical analyses of any number of things, of course. And the way you define rhetorical context can differ in a lot of ways. But as I mentioned toward the beginning of the workshop, the difference in this approach would just be that the rhetorical context is centered, or the context that we're analyzing is centered on disciplinary writing in some way, however you might define that in your class. On the right-hand side of the slide, I shared a little bit of information about a comparative rhetorical analysis. And this is an assignment that we basically invented at NC State. Other people may have done this too, but we came up with this assignment as a way to have students compare writing in 2 different disciplinary fields on the same topic. And we wanted them to do a more in-depth analysis looking at principles of rhetorical context, but looking at 2 specific pieces. And I've had students look at things in vastly differing disciplines. So with the climate change example I gave before, you might have somebody who looks at it from more of a humanistic approach, and they might be looking at something out of the discipline of philosophy, for example. And then they might be looking at something from the natural sciences. But then I've also had students who really kind of know what they want to focus on, what their interests are. And they've looked at disciplines that are only slightly different from each other, but different enough that it can be interesting to them to see how people approach the same question. So I had a student at NC State who was studying nuclear engineering. That was what he wanted to major in. And so he looked at a particular question from different areas within engineering. So if he looked at the same question from more of a nuclear engineering perspective versus materials science versus civil engineering, what kinds of questions might people ask? How might they approach that differently? And it was a really fascinating piece that he wrote. But those are just 2 examples of ways to approach that. I tend not to use a rhetorical approach for a full class, only because if I have students do rhetorical analyses for every single assignment, they start to get kind of bored. But there are ways to have them engage in understanding rhetorical context using a range of different kinds of creative approaches too. And so I tried to change that up a little bit. I might have them write a research proposal for something that they would do, where I ask them to address elements of rhetorical context within that proposal, for example. But just trying to change that up a little bit and then make the disciplinary context within which they would be doing that research part of the context that they talk about. All right. So I want to turn really quickly back to you all and ask you to just think about, of these 3 different approaches, what just on the surface, what appeals to you most and or maybe aligns with how you teach? And it might be that how you teach right now, you do or don't find appealing. I don't know. So I wanted to say and or. There certainly are some approaches that I've taken where I've done it for a while and then I realize that I kind of want to switch things up, but which of these do you find most appealing and aligns with how you would teach? And you could put that into the chat at this point if you would like. And then I did put a second question down there. If you have an assignment or something that you have used before, and it could be low stakes or high stakes, but an assignment that you've used before, or an assignment idea that you're thinking about right now that you'd like to try with your students, I would love if you would be willing to share that. And that we might do out loud if there's anybody that has an assignment, maybe something similar to what I've described, or it might be something very different or kind of a different take on one of those assignments that I've discussed. Yes, I can't see everybody's names.
I was going to say, I saw Nelson raised his hand. So Nelson, why don't you unmute yourself and share?
Sure, thanks. I teach using pretty much a rhetorical approach, but I use an assignment that that kind of combines some of at least that and a genre approach. In the sense, it's called a writing in your future discipline assignment. And what students have to do is they have to research the kind of writing that they're going to do in their future major. And they do that using syllabi from upper division courses in their major, professional writing in their discipline, and then writing in composition studies about writing in their discipline. There's some other source that they use as well, but and their major learning outcomes for their discipline. So they analyze all of those things to get an understanding of what the writing will be in their disciplines. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Nelson. I love that idea, and that reminded me of an assignment that one of our grad students came up with at NC State that I loved. He had his students basically compile sort of almost like quick tips sheets for writing in their disciplines for students who would be coming into those different majors. And I love that. I said, I mean, it's something that then they could use later too. But I love the idea of having them look at things like the learning outcomes in the discipline, different information that they have access to help them understand what kinds of things they might be writing and what would be expected. It's fantastic. Did anyone else have an assignment or something that they would be willing to share with the group?
Sorry, part of that is they do a genre analysis of the professional writing in their discipline.
Yes.
So they're adding that in there too.
Yeah. So Nelson, what range of professional writing do you have them look at? Are they looking primarily at like scholarly articles, or do you have them look more broadly at other kinds of professional writing?
It depends on the discipline. So for most disciplines, I have them look at at scholarly writing, at peer-reviewed writing. But sometimes for business, they'll look at business. And actually, what I do is I find a bunch of articles or ask them to use one of the syllabi that they've analyzed and find a reading from the syllabus and use that as what they're going to analyze.
And thank you so much. Mary Lourdes, I was really interested in what you wrote in the chat about, and it's kind of a nice, I would see it almost as kind of a mashup of a couple of the approaches that I was talking about, but looking at issues of social justice and how that is addressed in different disciplines. And I wondered, could you say a little bit about how is the social justice piece a part of what is focused on in your writing classes right now?
Sure. So I'm currently teaching a seminar course. It's a writing seminar course looking at tango as an instrument for social justice.
Mm.
And so recognizing that not everyone will know about tango or have ever danced tango, and but we'll be learning about this topic. But then I want them to be able to find ways to explore what types of genres or what types of platforms are being used or resources are being used to address issues of social justice. We have a large theater department at Ithaca College, so oftentimes, like, students will talk about the ways it's addressed in Broadway, and but then students will talk about the way it's addressed in yoga or in football or in oftentimes in various like embodied practices. Usually, because we are doing dance, so they often will just kind of draw from that theme, but encourage everyone to explore whichever topic they want to pursue. So I love your talk, and so it just got me thinking about to take a more like genre rhetorical approach to it, and to look at the different ways it's being discussed. So that's how I plan to like modify the assignment.
I love that. I hope that you'll share some of what you come up with, because I'm really interested to see how you might approach that.
Yeah, I've had students do these really fascinating multimodal research projects where they talk about issues of social justice in a particular discipline they're interested in. But I would like to add this element of like making it like more genre based and looking more like an analysis, like I don't do a traditional rhetorical analysis, but I would like to add this component to it. And so some type of analysis focusing more on the genre of it, so making it more apparent. So that's where I will tweak it. So thank you so much.
Yeah, awesome. I think that sounds great. I was looking at a couple of the other comments in the chat, and Dan, I was interested in what you said about using the approach of writing about writing. And I've often talked about, especially the rhetorical approach, as writing about writing in the disciplines, like in the way that I do it. So if I try to turn that into an acronym, it's a little awkward. It doesn't, I don't know, WID, it doesn't really roll off the tongue. But are there ways that you incorporate talking about disciplinary writing when you're teaching writing about writing?
I think the main way that I try to incorporate disciplinary writing is often I'll have students do an assignment where I teach them about the concept of discourse community and the relationship between genres and discourse community. And then occasionally I'll have a class where I'll have students, a major project for the class, a major research project is to analyze the genres of a discourse community that you want to join. And oftentimes that will be a disciplinary discourse community or a professional discourse community. And the thing I like about that approach is that when they're doing rhetorical analysis of a genre, they're framing it in the broader sense of the discourse community, which I think is a nice additional layer to rhetorical analysis.
Yeah. I really like that. And I like the way that kind of makes talking about disciplinary writing or professional writing or the things that they would be doing in their major. Like it's one of the options, one of many that they could look at, but it's not necessarily a requirement. I know that sometimes having my students identify like what their major is or what the writing looks like in their major in a first year course, that can be challenging and sometimes problematic, since so many students are really kind of working through what it is that they want to focus on. And so having it as an option, but maybe not a requirement, sometimes is a way to take the pressure off as well. And I like that approach of thinking about it as entering discourse communities and identifying when they want to enter into. And in a sense, I kind of hope that in my first year writing classes that students might come out of that class having a better understanding of what they might be interested in too. Sometimes looking at the writing in different professions, different disciplines can really make that clearer. I, of all people, should know that students don't always know what they want to do when they enter college. I think I changed my major every year as an undergrad. And then in grad school, I found rhetoric, which allows us to kind of, in a way, we can sort of study all the things rhetorically, which I was like, I found my home. This works for me. But I noticed in the chat that several people mentioned that the topical approach was new to them, that they hadn't done something like that before, and that was of interest. And I wondered if, is there anyone else who has tried kind of a topical approach in their class before, and has an idea or something that has worked well that they'd like to share?
I've got an idea that I would share for a first year seminar course I taught, which was focused on sort of different forms of work. So it's still this idea of joining different discourse communities, but I had just assembled a panel of faculty from across campus and brought in a pound of hamburger, and then asked the faculty to sort of answer a set of questions about how they were oriented towards that, that topic. And so one of the things I was proud of myself for was realizing that one of the differences is not just sort of what they see, but also how they measure it. So the sort of the methodology is getting implied there in interesting ways. So the difference between a dietitian thinking about that in terms of calories and how many calories are involved and maybe nutritional value versus my colleague who's a micro or molecular biologist, really seeing that as like a sort of a petri dish for a lot of undesirables, especially sort of just, sitting on a table with no refrigeration. And so that was a way that I tried to stretch students into thinking about the way that what you see in a topic is different depending on the discipline you're coming to it from. So anyway, I just wanted to share that as one thing that I've done. I think it would be possible to translate that towards first year comp pretty easily.
Oh, Rick, that's brilliant. I love that. The using something that is such a sort of common object and then having them in real time kind of talk through how they're oriented toward that. Such a great idea. And I have had faculty, or more commonly upper division students in different disciplines, do a panel and talk about writing in their field, but that's still kind of abstract. I love this because it sort of demonstrates. I can tell you exactly the kinds of questions that my professors in the culinary arts program would ask about that pound of hamburger. I would immediately want to put a thermometer in it and figure out, like, how long has it been sitting out here? Yeah, Debbie mentioned in the chat, even a bottle of water, especially if you bring in a little individual one in plastic that you buy like at the convenience store. So then you've got, people thinking about recycling and sustainability. And I love it. This is giving me all kinds of ideas. It's the best part about workshops.
Susan, I'm going to jump in with two things. We're just about at 5 minutes, so giving that heads up. And there was a question from Dan. Susan, do you have thoughts about initiating students to the writing in their disciplines versus teaching students to question conventions and think critically about them? I'm especially thinking of anti-racist ways to enact a WID approach in first-year composition, and this is something I really struggle with.
Yes, I'm so glad you asked that, Dan, because the question of conventions by nature is implementing norms, right? Here, if it's okay, I'm gonna stop sharing the screen and then we can all see each other too. So one thing that I've been thinking about a lot, and I can't say that I have enacted this in my own classes much yet, but it's certainly something that I've been thinking about, how we might approach this in our textbook too, is in the way that, so I mentioned that framework of talking about structure, language, and reference. And language, especially, is one of those areas that, since my background is originally was in applied linguistics and studying language change and teaching ESL, but understanding world Englishes as plural and the nature of language change, I think talking about those conventions of language and questioning a lot of the conventions that tend to circulate that people think of as common to academic English. And these aren't always things that are discipline specific, although there may be, this is something I'd have to dig into more in specific disciplines, there may be specific disciplinary ways of thinking and knowing that manifest in the language used that would be really fruitful places for discussion about anti-racism and thinking about, as Mary Lourdes was bringing up, thinking about social justice. If the course was framed originally in questions about language use and writing and anti-racism and social justice, then as you move into looking at disciplinary ways of thinking, knowing, and expressing, that's something I've been wanting to figure out how to address in meaningful ways in my classes for a long time. And I feel like the current moment, and specifically some of the scholars in our field, like Asal, have really called us to raise questions about that. So I think analyzing the conventions of language and the expectations of language across the disciplines is definitely one of the places where I would be emphasizing that and asking students to ask questions about, and this is where maybe reflective writing would come in too. How does this resonate with experiences that they've had? What is it asking them to embrace or perhaps question or abandon about their own language backgrounds? But all of this has to, I mean, if you're having those conversations, maybe it goes without saying, but it needs to be done within the context of helping students feel safe in sharing those experiences or writing about them and not sharing them, if that's what's most appropriate in that context too. Does anyone else have some ideas in response to Dan's question? Because it's a really great one.
Oh yeah, I was gonna say the question from Nelson, and people are saying great idea, great point about reflective writing.
Oh yeah, Nelson says, one thing I've done, Dan, is to ask students to find scholars in their field who share oppressed identities with them. Yeah. And maybe, I mean, we might have as the starting point, looking at what is shared in common in a field, but then start to look at ways people push against and change or question those. And I mean, we can certainly look in our own field at scholarship from people like Rashawn, people who have really pushed against some of the assumptions of how we should express ourselves.
I see a comment about having international students share their perspective. Assessment practices and rubrics as a way to address it.
Yes.
Literacy essay that focuses on epistemology and have the opportunity to talk about differences in epistemology among cultures, not just disciplines.
Absolutely. One experimental class that I taught, and I know we're just about out of time, when I was at Mesa Community College that I loved, we had classes that were specifically designed for our international or ESL students. So the same first year writing, but it was taught by teachers who had a background in teaching ESL. And so sometimes I taught those classes, sometimes I taught the other section of first year writing that was, I guess, for monolingual students, although that was not always clearly defined. I won't get into the politics of that right now. That's another whole workshop, how people identify in terms of their language use. But I taught one of those sections where we divided the enrollment. So it was half English 107 and half English 101. And I centered the whole course around talking about cross-cultural composition and assumptions and conventions in different cultural contexts. And it was so enjoyable to teach. Paul Matsuda and Tony Silva have written about using a similar kind of approach. I did publish a brief article about that in Teaching English in the Two-Year College several years ago. But I think there are a lot of interesting ways to have, especially your ESL students, international students, focus on and maybe feel more expertise in language use when they understand that we acknowledge that there are some issues with how we're defining those language norms too. That's a challenging thing to do, but yes. And Sundi, thank you. Looking at indigenous epistemologies as ways of knowing and languaging too. Also very important. So I know we're at 12:30 and it's time to get going.
And I was going to say, I shared the English community in the chat. I also shared my email because if anyone would be interested in getting a copy of an Insider's Guide, the new edition that's publishing, feel free to contact me directly and I'll make sure you get them. That's one coming out in September. Because you're more great ideas in the book. So I think I like it.
And I put my email in the chat too. If there are other questions or any ideas that you want to just bat around for follow-up, please feel free to reach out to me. I love talking about these kinds of questions and just about teaching and learning in general. So don't hesitate to reach out. And thank you again for coming in, for your wonderful contributions in the conversation. Yes, I will put the slide deck up right away. I was still trying to figure out how to upload everything last night. But I'll get the slide deck up there so that it's available, and feel free to reference it and let me know if you have questions about it. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. It was a great conversation.